You all set?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
You are on the big screen. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for the last of our Hobart William Smith speaker series. We have Mark here tonight, who is the professor of biology, who will be talking about birds in our landscape, tracking spring migration. And I will turn it over to Mark for tonight's webinar.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Alexis, and she's going to stick around in case we have some technical issues and help me monitor the chats and questions. So there are two ways you can ask questions tonight. You can type a question in the chat, or you should have the ability, if you're on a computer, to raise your hand, and we can monitor it that way as well.
Yeah. And if you are on a smartphone or iPhone, you also have that ability to raise your hand, and it's just located in a different spot, and you should be able to find that as well.
And what I'll do is, it's a little hard to monitor raised hands in chat in this sort of while I'm talking, so I'll try and take some pauses. But if I forget that, or if you have a question, just save it till the end, and we can get to it at that point. So I'm going to share my screen and get started. Can everybody see that? The birds in our landscape tracking spring migration. Is that, Alexis, you see that? Good, thumbs up. All right. All right, so I'm going to be going in between sort of PowerPoint and a couple of other things. So I'm going to sort of leave it up in this mode for now. And then I'll go, but I'll be going back and forth through a couple of things. So my name, as Alexis said, I'm Mark Deutschlander. I work at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, where I teach biology and ornithology. And I also work at the Braddock Bay Bird Observatory, which is where this picture is taken. And I'm also associated, I'm a past president of the Wilson Ornithological Society, which is the second largest and second oldest society for sort of academic ornithologists in the United States. Although we're an international group at this point. So welcome everybody. I'm gonna find out why you're here in a little bit. Some of you may be here because you may be new to birding, and certainly the situation we find ourselves in as a world has opened up birding to some new people here. A couple headlines from stories from Audubon, right from their website, related to COVID-19 stories. So birding is the perfect activity while practicing social distancing came out last, about a year ago, I think. And then Audubon started doing things like this, where they were bringing birds to the people. Just this morning, I was watching a Zorowski Optics video where they were going all around the country showing birding, and a local, they showed Braddock Bay Raptor Research and Braddock Bay Bird Observatory this morning. Even with the cold weather, they had some birds up there. So lots of virtual birding's been happening. Bird watching has been good for the economy, at least the people who are in things that are selling things like seed suppliers and bird houses. So lots of people are sort of connecting with nature, whether it's in their backyards or getting out regionally. And certainly the pandemic's had effects on wildlife and other species. Some of it's been positive, and some of it hasn't been positive. So, research has stalled, or at least had for the last year. It's harder to do the kinds of work that field biologists do when there's a pandemic. But there have certainly been benefits of, not burning as many fossil fuels and things like that for birds. So the pandemic has certainly opened up the world of birding to some people, but the world of birding is a pretty big place. There's lots of people who do birding as a hobby. And so this is another thing I stole off the Audubon website. What I want to do before I go any further is find out just a little bit about all of you. So I have two polls I'm going to run. So first poll is asking you about your experience. So I'm going to launch this poll. So how much experience? How would you rate your experience and knowledge of birds and birding? You have no experience. You didn't know that bird was a noun and a verb. You're a novice. You have some experience, intermediate, expert, or you're a community leader. I mean, you go birding and you lead local field trips all the time. So go ahead and pop in an answer there. We got a few people with no experience. About a dozen or so novices, about 20 or so intermediates. So you do some birding and you know how to identify birds fairly well. I got no experts and no community leaders. Good, then nobody will question anything I say. I'm the expert on the screen, that's good. All right, so I'm gonna end that poll. And then I wanted to find out one more thing. So most of you have some experience. So I think here you should be able to select anything. Select all that apply. So what kinds of things have you used when you look at birds? So paperback field guides like a Pearson guide or a Sibley guide, web-based resources, eBird, something called the Merlin app. If you don't know what these are, obviously you won't check those. Birdcast. You completed some online courses through Bird Academy, which is the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's website. Or you participate in projects like Feeder Watch or Christmas Bird Count. Cool, we got a lot of people who use field guides, not surprising. About half of you are using web-based resources. About 42% of you know what eBird is. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. About half of you know what the Merlin app is. 6% of you know Birdcast. That's good. I can teach you all something about Birdcast, or most of you. And then about 20% have done some online courses or participated in Project Feeder Watch or the Christmas Bird Count. Cool. So all of those are things you're going to hear about a little bit tonight. I'm going to end that poll. Thank you for participating. So before I go into the talk about migration, I want to just play a short film for you, a two-minute little film clip. So I need to switch my screen here. So some of you may be aware last year, maybe this was now the fall before last. So the fall before the pandemic, a big research article came out about loss of biodiversity in birds in the United States. And this is from the 3 Billion Birds website, because that is the estimated number of birds that have been lost from our area since the 1970s. So I want to play this little 2-minute video about that research.
Birds are part of our lives. They fill the air with song, inspire us with their beauty, and make their homes in the most unexpected places. Sometimes they're even our neighbors. But the birds we love are vanishing. An alarming new study reveals that the population of North American birds has dropped nearly 30% since 1970. That's almost 3 billion birds gone, vanished from our forests, grasslands, and backyards in less than the span of a human lifetime. Some of the hardest hit are familiar birds: orioles, meadowlarks, swallows, warblers. What's driving this decline? Birds are losing the habitats they need, places to live, find food, rest, and raise their young. They face many other threats as well, from free-roaming cats and collisions with glass to toxic pesticides and insect declines. Climate change will compound all of these problems and accelerate the loss of habitats birds need. This enormous loss of birds signals a broader crisis in the natural world, one that ultimately affects us all. But it's not too late. Our actions on behalf of birds make a positive difference and benefit the entire planet. Thanks to strong conservation efforts and habitat management, many waterfowl and formerly endangered species are now flourishing. It's time to expand these conservation efforts to help the rest of our birds recover too. With our help, they can be restored as a vital part of the American landscape and a precious part of our lives. We're united in pursuing better protections and increased support for birds. And you can help. Please join us.
So you can learn more about this project at the 3 Billion Birds website. It was a joint project between a lot of different people and a lot of different organizations. So I invite you to check that out on the website. Let me get back to my... So I can go in this mode right now. Okay. So they said there's things you can do. Join us, right? Also outlined on the 3 Billion Birds website is basically 7 simple things that you could do to help birds. So if you're not a conservation biologist, right, what do you do? So these are some of the things. You can make your windows safer, because windows are problematic for some birds, and there's information about that. There's glass that is safer for birds, especially on high rises in big cities. If you have cats, you want to keep them indoors as much as possible, because cats do kill birds. It's sort of instinctual, and even if your cat doesn't drag a bird back into your house, it's quite likely it's at least terrorizing, if not killing some birds while it's outside. Using native plants is good for the environment. Native plants have very nutritional sources for birds and a lot of exotic plants. Pesticides are certainly harmful. Not only the pesticides used by farmers, but the pesticides that people use on their lawns and things like that. Citizen science, we'll talk a little bit about that today, what you could do to get involved and reduce your plastic use. And if you drink coffee, like I do, you can drink shade-grown coffee, which is better for, provides better habitat for birds down in the tropics where those coffee plantations are. So you can learn more about those things. I'm not going to be talking about most of those tonight, but I did want to sort of put this in the context of this loss that's occurred. It's pretty shocking to think that 30% of the birds have been lost since 1970. 1970 was, I was born in the late 1969, so right before 1970, so that's basically my lifetime. So I'm going to talk about the scale and scope of migration, using some nice maps to show you some different migratory species. Talk about a little bit about what drives these migrations, why they occur, looking at how birds find their way, how they prepare for and accomplish migrations, and a little bit about how scientists track migrations and how you can track migration. So if you're interested in looking at birds, what are the resources you have available to find out more about the birds around you? So I'm going to start with an individual story, then we'll look at a couple different species. So this is not any one bird that has been tracked. This is sort of a made-up track that this particular bird could take. And this bird is the Wilson's warbler. So it's the mascot of the Wilson Ornithological Society. So I had to put that up there. Wilson's warblers, before they migrate in the spring, they tend to winter down in Central America, and their winter territory is down in maybe southern Mexico, like Chiapas. You could find these guys, which is one of the southernmost states in Mexico. And they spend about 6 months down there. They're in mixed species flocks. They're omnivorous, so they're eating all kinds of things while they're down there. And on the upper right, you can see a picture of Chiapas. I've actually been to Chiapas and banded birds there. Great place. But for migration, let's think about what an individual has to do. So from Chiapas, that individual may go up the Yucatan Peninsula. It may make some of these things called stopovers, where it stops to rest and refuel. And then this is a trans-Gulf migrant. It flies over the Gulf of Mexico. So it gets enough fuel while it's on the Yucatan. That fuel is in the form of fat that puts on its body, and will make that 600-mile journey over the Gulf of Mexico, where it probably won't see land until it hits something like Dauphin Island in Alabama. which is a really well-known stopover site for checking out birds during migration in fall and spring. From there, that little Wilson warbler, and again, this is a small bird. I should put it in context. This is probably, you know, I should have checked. I think they're maybe 10 grams or so, pretty small. If I'm going to see this bird where I'm working, it's going to go another 1,000 miles up to New York. And I work at a place called Braddock Bay, which is just up here on the lake shore of Ontario. And this is the western side of Braddock Bay. There's also a hawk watch that occurs up there on the eastern side of Braddock Bay. And then from there, if I were to capture that bird and band it, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, that bird may go anywhere into its breeding range. And this is a boreal breeding songbird. So it breeds in the boreal forest way up in Canada. And so it makes roughly, you know, a 3,000 plus mile journey. And it does that in about 3 to 4 weeks. Again, for a small 10-gram bird, that is a pretty amazing journey to make in that short amount of time. So that's one particular example. Now, migration happens at all kinds of scales. So at the two extremes, we sort of talk about migration as being, there are short distance, or what we call temperate migrants. These are birds that roughly stay within the United States. They don't go down into South America. They may go down a little bit into Central America. And they go maybe up into a little bit in Canada. But they're basically staying within the continent of North America. They're not going into Central America and South America. So these are some examples of birds that do that. I've had tons of the birds on the upper right at my bird feeder today. Lots of red-winged blackbirds, so they're coming back. They're one of the earliest migrants to come back, but I've seen quite a few today with the snow. By the way, when I planned this talk for April, I wasn't planning on a snow day. I was planning on a nice spring day, but you know, the birds are still coming back. And then we have the long distance migrants. So we have these intercontinental migrants. So they're super long distance. We call them neotropical migrants because they're going down into the neotropics. And they're actually spending more time down in the neotropics than they spend up here. So we tend to think of these as our birds flying south, but in reality, most of these are neotropical birds coming north for a brief breeding season in the summer. So and it's really much too early to see any of these guys back yet. They tend to come a little bit later during migration. You know, in May and June, we'll start seeing most of these species around. But I'm going to talk about a few of these. So you might recognize the purple martin on the left. I'll talk about the black-polled warbler on the upper right. I'll also talk about the Swainson's thrush, which is the one down there on the lower left. I'm not going to talk about the cuckoo, although the cuckoos are pretty cool. So let's look at just a couple different examples. So like everything in biology where you have this dichotomy, there's usually, it's a false dichotomy. There's really, you know, a continuum of migration that occurs. So here's the eastern bluebird. Why the eastern bluebird? Very recognizable probably to most of you. Also, it's the New York state bird, and it's the state bird for a whole bunch of other states too. So this is a partial migrant. So only some of these individuals migrate. Usually in the spring, somebody's like, oh, I'm seeing bluebirds. I'm like, well, that's good, but bluebirds are something you can see all winter long. So some of them stick around and others do not. And if you've used, and 97% of you said you've used a paper field guide. So if you use those field guides, you know you have maps like this that show where you can find these birds during their breeding range or their wintering time and year round, right? So you got different colors there that show you where to find them. But on the internet, you can find these great resources. So, and I actually should go to this slide first. So eBird is this wonderful platform run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And it's a way that we collect information, or Cornell collects information from birders. So people who are out bird watching, who are on eBird. eBird's great because you can log in your sightings and you can keep a record of what you've seen. You can look back and you have your own history of what you've seen, but you're also giving data to scientists. And people are submitting eBird records from around the world. And so that data is being used to produce all new kinds of maps that we can use to understand migration. So I'm going to show you a few of those maps. And you can go to these maps if you go to this website. I downloaded the maps earlier, but you can go to this website and you can type in a species and you can see these sort of maps for any species that you want. So I'm going to show you the eastern bluebird. hopefully it's opening. There we go. So so what's going to happen is I'm going to hit play, and over here you can see the time of the year, and you can see the relative. These colors show relative abundance. So the bluer colors, the cooler colors, are actually more abundance, and the warmer colors are less abundance on these maps. Okay. So, and if you watch, so right now the map is frozen in January, right? And I told you you could find bluebirds in January in New York, and so you can, but you find a lot more of them, right? So these are eBird reports. So people who are reporting seeing bluebirds in January see a lot more bluebirds than they see up in New York. So if we watch this map, we get a sense of the movement of this population. Right, so now we're getting into June. You can see it sort of spreads out, right? So the concentration goes down. So you're getting a sense of what's happening here, right? So the birds are sort of very concentrated in the south, right? And then they spread upwards where they fan out a little bit. You don't see them as in big flocks anymore because they're breeding, and they're breeding across that whole range. So there's migration going on there, but nothing, you know, there's not huge movements happening there. And the birds are basically in the same, most of the same places you find the birds almost year round, with a little bit of northern expansion during the breeding season. All right, so that's our bluebird. So robin's another very familiar bird. This is a classic temperate migrant. Lots of robins are around my yard now, and we're around today. But again, robins, if you look at the static map, or something, you know, you can see in New York all the time, but you see a lot more of them now during migration than you see in other times of the year. So let's look at the robin map, and you'll see how that sort of differs from the bluebird map. So again, during our January start, first of all, robins go out to the West Coast, so that's a difference. But if you look over here where we are, you know, in this sort of half of the country, sort of similar to the bluebird, right? But watch what happens with migration. So we get a much farther movement up north, right? And in the most southern states, they sort of aren't breeding, right? And so they're only in those places in the winter. So that's part of your classic sort of temperate migrant, short distance migrant movement. And it's important to note, you know, you might see robins in New York in the winter, but those robins are not the same robins you're going to see in the summer. So there's basically a shift in the population, where the most northern birds during the winter are the birds more likely to head even more north during the breeding season in the middle of the summer, when you get to the J&Js, the June and July on the map. All right, let me get rid of that one. So let's look at some longer examples of migration. So here's the yellow rump warbler. This is a bird that there's actually two subspecies. There's the eastern species that we would see here. It's called the myrtle warbler. And the western species is called the Audubon warbler. What I like about this species, if you look at the map, you can't tell in this map, but first of all, you can see they're spread across the whole country, right? And you can see where they are in the winter, right, and where they go. So they're like the Wilson's warbler. They're one of these boreal breeding songbirds. But when you watch the map, you'll be able to see the sort of two halves of the country in terms of the two subspecies. So let me show you that one. So this is in the summer, so we move upwards, right? And as you can see, they pretty much almost all go out of the United States up into Canada, right? And then they move back down. And one of the things you can see on all these maps, I don't know if you noticed it on the other map, and you'll start to notice it on these long distance migrant maps even more. Like, look at the time. So the time they're down south, right, is much longer than the time they go up north. So they go up north, there's a short breeding season, and then they pop back down. So the breeding season for these birds is really, it's critical time, because it's when, of course, they're making more of the same species, but it's a really short time of year for them. They're spending most of their time in their wintering sites with a very quick migration, right, in between wintering site and breeding site, and a very quick breeding time. But you sort of, I don't know if you saw that, I'll play it one more time. You get a sense of these two populations. So the myrtle over on this side of the country, and over on this side of the country, you have on the West Coast, you have the Audubon's version of the yellow rump warbler. All right. Tried to embed these in the talk earlier, but it just did not work. So that's why I have those skipped slides. So let's look at some longer distance migrants. Swainson's thrush. So this is a species I've studied. I'm going to show you some more information about them a little later in the talk. They're a neotropical migrant, boreal breeding, but you can see from this static map, these birds are going even farther down south during that wintering time. So they're going mostly into South America, a little bit up into here into Central America. So let's look at the Swainson's thrush map. And Swainson's thrush is an interesting story for me while you watch this. So I told you I abandoned birds down in Chiapas, Mexico many years ago. And I was before I went down there, I'm like, what is going to be the first cool Mexican bird, you know, that I get? And I banned. Well, it was a Swainson's thrush, a bird that I banned and I work with up here in New York. So that was sort of cool. Well, let's look at this map one more time. So there you can see they are in the winter, right? And then there's a quick migration in the spring. Right, a quick breeding, and almost like, oh, it turns around real quick, and then a slower but still quick migration back down to the southern wintering grounds. So further distance. So again, there's a sort of scale, right, of migration, and now we're getting into the longer end of that scale. I like to show these because, you know, the birds are really the stars of these talks. You know, 60 people didn't come to listen to me. 60 people signed up to hear about birds.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
You have 2 questions in the chat.
Oh, okay. Can you read them?
Yep.
I can't see them when I'm sharing.
No, you're fine.
Yeah.
One was had a question about the birds that you had listed on the slides. I think it was like the 4-slided picture.
Oh, yes.
They wanted to know what the names of those birds were.
Oh, okay. I'll cycle back to that in a minute.
And then the other one was prior to I think it was the Swanson bird. Like
Swainson, yeah.
They wanted to know the bird previous to that, if those birds produce hybrids.
Oh, the myrtle warblers and the Avon warblers. Well, they are subspecies, so they can breed together. They're not distinct species. So hybrid would be when we have 2 distinct species that can breed together, and they haven't had enough isolation yet to sort of divide them into 2 different species. So they can, where they overlap, they can breed together. And I'll go back up to those slides in a little bit after I get through with this part and just review who we talked about. And one thing I forgot to point out actually. So 3 of the birds I talked about are actually quite closely related. So eastern bluebird, which is that partial migrant, American robin, which is that temperate migrant, which everybody's sort of familiar with those, and Swainson's thrush, which some of you may not be familiar with. Those are all related. So they're all thrushes. Our robin is actually a thrush, and our bluebird is actually a thrush too. So they all are in the same family of birds, closely related, yet they have this very different migration from each other in terms of the species. This is a bird near and dear to my heart because it's the first bird I ever did research on. It is the bobolink, and it's an extremely long distance migrant. It is trans-equatorial. It goes 6,000 miles. It's one of the longest annual migration of any songbird. And if you haven't noticed yet, I'm focusing on songbirds because that's what I study. There's lots of migration that's cool, and raptors and shorebirds, but we're focusing on songbirds tonight. So while I've been talking, some of you have hopefully been reading this slide about where these go, and you can see on the map. So let's just look at this animated map. So these birds are known as rice birds in South America because they go down here as far into Chile and Argentina, and they can decimate rice fields while they're down there. So rice farmers don't like them very much. And there you can see they disappear and they popped up here, right? So that's a real quick migration. They're not even showing up on eBird lists very much in between, right? So they make a very quick but a very long migration. And the equator is not on here, but they are crossing the equator during that migration. And when I was a undergraduate at Geneseo, this is the first bird I ever studied the migration of. So it's, again, near and dear to my heart. But amazing, right? And I always tell my students, songbirds are really the athletes, or birds in general, migrants, are really incredible athletes. So if you're into athletics and all that, you want to know about birds because they are awesome athletes.
And you have 2 questions. Do you want to take those?
Hold off 1 second. I want to show you the athlete of all athletes, and
Yep.
then we'll go to the questions. So I'm going to show you this map first. I'm going to see if you can tell what's happening in this map. And this is Blackpoll warbler. So some of you who know birds might know what this bird does. But watch this map and see if you can figure out what's happening. So there they are in the winter. There you see them spreading up in the north. Watch what happens in spring or in fall. So you notice, play it again. When they come up in the spring, you see them sort of spread across, and they get picked up little bits of them here in Florida and stuff on the maps. But when they come down in the spring, all of a sudden, you don't see them go through Florida. You don't see them go across Cuba or anything like that. And that's because these birds do something truly amazing. And that is they jump out across the Atlantic in the fall. So here's a static map, and I can show this a little better on the static map. All these birds that breed, so all these Blackpoll warblers that breed across Canada, the western ones fly east first, and then they all gather here on the maritime, so the Atlantic provinces and Atlantic states. And they go as far down as sort of Delaware, Maryland. And then instead of going here and crossing, the Gulf of Mexico, that measly little 600-mile trip, which is a big trip for a small songbird, they take off across the Atlantic, and they don't make landfall until they hit Brazil. They do this by basically a lean and mean Blackpoll warbler is 12 grams. They fatten up and they double their body mass. So before they make this journey, they go to 23 grams. And then they make this 2,300-mile journey if they're sort of here up around New York or Massachusetts, let's say. And they make that in about 72 hours. So they're doing 660 miles per day. And in human terms, that's 4-minute miles for 80 consecutive hours, if anybody knows how it runs 4-minute miles, right? So that is pretty insane, right, that they're doing that. And they're doing that, if I told you to run 4-minute miles for that long, but after you doubled your body mass, you can imagine the physiological, amazingness of what these birds are doing. So I'll stop there. That's my sort of scope of migration from sort of the shortest to the longest of some I just picked. There was a question about which birds are up here. So this is yellow-bellied sapsucker, red-winged blackbird. This is white-throated sparrow, and that's our yellow rump warbler. You can see his yellow rump. Bird banders and birders sometimes call them butterbutts. And then we have purple martins, Blackpoll warblers, Swainson's thrushes, and black-billed cuckoo there. So yeah, before I go on, Alexis, what were the other questions?
I think you might have answered one of them, but they wanted to know the breeding, if you could describe the breeding timeline.
It depends on the species, right? So it's that summertime, period. So something that arrives early, like the red-winged blackbirds, they can start, the males are arriving now. I've seen one female, the females will arrive a little bit later, and they'll start breeding as soon as everybody gets here. And they'll breed till sort of into August, so they can have a longer breeding period. Some of the longer distance migrants have shorter breeding periods because it takes more time to get here. They don't get here till later in the spring or early summer, and then they are leaving early because they have that longer pathway to go. So it just depends on the species how long the breeding periods are. Some birds can pull off more than one nest in a breeding season. They can have multiple nests. But it just depends on how long that is.
And
what was the next one, Alexis?
I have one that says, why don't some of these birds go south to, I'm going to say this wrong, but it's Patagonia instead of Canada?
Oh, Patagonia? Oh, so, well, I'm just concentrating on a few species in terms of their ranges about where they go. So, if we were looking at, this is in Patagonia, but if we were looking at European species, you'd have the same sorts of things in terms of short distance and long distance migrants. There's some migration that occurs in Australia, right? So I'm doing a very North American, South American sort of focus here for sure, and just picking a few species to give sort of scale there.
And then we have, at what altitude do they fly?
I'll get to that in just a little bit.
Okay.
Okay.
And then there is a question that asks regarding the unihemispheric slow wave sleep, but it looks like that same person has their hand raised, so I can let them ask that question.
Why don't we hold off on that one?
Okay.
And I'll come back. So let me get through, I'm just watching time. I want to make sure I get through a couple other things. Okay.
Awesome. Okay.
Okay.
And then,
Okay. Yeah, why don't we do a couple more and we'll get back to the questions.
okay, awesome.
Okay. Okay. So I just want to run through, so that's just some examples of scope. Let's just run through a couple of quick this is Migration 101 really quick. So challenges of migration. You can imagine what some of these might be, but I've listed some here. So intrinsically, there's that energetic nutritional requirement for putting on lots of fat. Birds need lots of antioxidants to cope with their physiological challenges. They need a lot of water. Thermoregulation can be an issue while they're migrating. And navigation is an issue as well. How do they find their way? They also have extrinsic challenges. So they're going to be in novel habitats. You think about those first birds out of the nest, making their first migratory journey. Everything's novel along that migratory journey. And so they have novel habitats. They may have novel predators. They may have resource availability issues. I think about now, right? Snow hit the ground here today in New York, right? And so that creates a problem for some birds in finding resources and for the birds that arrive the earliest during the spring. So that's why my feeder was so active, because that's an easier resource for them. And they have to deal with climatic conditions, annual variation, climatic change, storms and hurricanes. Fall migration happens during hurricane season, and birds like the blackpolls will head out over the Atlantic and hit hurricanes, and that's problematic for them. So they have lots of challenges. What drives these migrations? People tend to think temperature, because that's why we go south, but it's food. So migration is primarily a response to food abundance. And if we think of about most of these birds as being neotropical birds that are coming up north to breed, then why they're coming up north because there's a summer, what we call protein pulse at northern latitudes. So in the boreal forests, it is insect heaven up there in the summer. And if you don't like mosquitoes, you don't want to be up in the tundra and on the boreal forest. There's mosquitoes everywhere. But that provides protein for those birds to feed their young. Migration in most what we call obligate migrants, so migrants that are going every year, is even though food is what they're after, they can predict their changes in food by tracking changes in day length. So for in the fall, when the days start getting shorter, that's a sign that they're going to leave, right? But if they're eruptive migrants, so eruptive migrants only migrate in some years, their migration is triggered by changes in food supply. So I put a couple examples of eruptive migrants down here. Snowy owls are eruptive migrants, so they go and come down south from the tundra when the relative amount of food per owl is low, and the food is lemmings and things like that. We had a big eruption of what are called the eruptive finches, which a couple of them are shown here. We have the red crossbills and pine grosbeak shown here. And they move south only when the seeds that they depend on in the north have these population crashes. And so there's not enough seeds to feed all the finches. So the finches move south. And some of these finches are pretty much stay up north all winter. We're going as far south as Texas this winter looking for food. How do birds prepare for migration? Well, one thing they do is prepare by eating a lot. So they have what's called hyperphagia. They increase their mass, and some birds increase their body mass by 50%, or as you saw in the blackpoll warbler, they double their body mass. So that's one way they prepare. They also use favorable winds. So they coordinate their departure with favorable tailwinds. So they're going to move behind cold fronts in the fall, and they're going to move with warm fronts in the spring. And most of these songbirds migrate at night. So they're, even though they're birds that we tend to see during the day and they're active during the day, at other times of year they move at night, probably because there's less turbulence in the atmosphere at night for them to deal with, because the sun isn't heating up the ground and causing a lot of turbulent air. They find their way by using the Earth's magnetic field, which is depicted in this graph on the right, or picture on the right. And they also use cues from sunsets as well as star patterns to guide their ways. So here you have an American redstart flying over a map and compass. And birds do have both a map and compass. They can tell not only what direction they want to go, but adult birds can certainly tell where they are using things like the Earth's magnetic field and keeping track of that. Their timing, the migration occurs in spurts. So it's not just one long, migration from one end to the other. They have those stopover sites, which I mentioned earlier, and those are just places they stop to rest and to refuel. And those sites can vary in quality. So here are 3 different habitats, and the kind of habitat is going to depend on the species, right? What kind of stopover habitat they need. But, habitat can vary in quality. This is a slide one of my students came up with I sort of liked. So these are our quality of habitat when we're traveling and where we stop, right? You can do a text stop, which has no food, right? You just stop to rest and text. Birds don't text, but they stop to rest. This is a fast food location. So some places have food, but it's not very good food. It's not very nutritional food. And this is my student's example of a very highly nutritional site, a very nice Italian restaurant, which would have, you get a nice salad and things like that. So birds have sort of variation in stopover quality as well. And sometimes they have to stop at, the equivalent of a text stop. There's no food there, but they have to stop and rest, for example, when they come across the Gulf of Mexico. And sometimes you'll find birds in large flocks on oil platforms out in the middle of the Gulf, well, not in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, but just off the coast, because they're so exhausted and they see any sort of land and they stop there even though there's no food for them to eat. So a couple other things. So migration paths are not always direct. They're often characterized by having different legs of the journey. So why do those black poles that head from the West Coast, why do they come east first and then go south? It's probably it has to do with how their paths evolved. But you have these different legs of the journey. You can have migration paths that differ between different populations of the same species. They can differ between juveniles and adults. Sometimes they can differ by gender, by male and female. And so you can have all kinds of differences in sort of subtle differences that individuals have in their migratory paths. In spring, I mentioned this earlier, is typically faster paced than fall. And spring and fall migration paths can vary. And so we get what are called clockwise loop migrations. And here's a little video here. I'll put this in play mode. This is eBird data. These are not individuals. These dots are sort of the center of a population. So those are all different species. And they're trying to give you a sense of the total movement of migration in our hemisphere. And you can see sort of all different overall population movements that depend on the species as that occurs. And you can also see if it plays again. It should play again. No, hang on. I go back and forth. You'll notice the spring migration is, for most of these dots, is much faster moving than the fall return migration. Watch them come back. As a migration biologist, I love watching things move on maps. So hopefully you're getting a little bit of the excitement of seeing that I get. All right, let's see. So what time is it? Let me just keep going with a couple other things, then we'll just come to a question period. How's that sound? So tracking migration. How can you track migration? Actually, I can go back into this mode for now. So citizen science, right? So you can use eBird to help track migration. You can explore the eBird data online, and you can use your phone when you're out birding to get on and log in what you're seeing. So you can help collect data that's going to help us learn more about the movement of those birds. So I can't remember what percentage of you said you use eBird. That's good to see. I'm pretty bad at using eBird when I go out birding. I don't use it as much as I should, but I know a lot of people who use it quite a bit, and I'm getting better at using it slowly. So usually, if you're birding, get on eBird and use it. It's a great way to keep track of your sightings and help scientists keep track of your sightings and everybody else's too. Project Feeder Watch is a way, if you have bird feeders, to monitor birds in the winter. And so that's through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology as well. So you can sign up to be a feeder watcher. It's a real easy sort of thing to do. So if you're looking at birds on your feeder all winter, check out Project Feeder Watch. You can help contribute to the data set there. Christmas bird count is another thing that you can get involved with. It doesn't occur on Christmas Day. It occurs around Christmas. It's one of the longest running examples of citizen science. It's been happening since 1900, I believe, when it first started. And there's a Christmas bird count everywhere. So wherever you live, there's a Christmas bird count in your area that somebody's running, and you can look it up and find out about it online. And it's usually, I think, between the I'm not going to get the dates right for those of you who do it, but it's mid-December through early January. It occurs sometime in your area in that period. So those are ways you can help. That's the citizen science aspect. If you need help identifying birds, you got that bird book, but you can put an app on your phone, again, through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology called Merlin. And Merlin is a great way to get started, when you get started, to help you identify the birds that you're seeing. It asks a few questions about, what size is the bird that you're seeing? And, it's basically, is it smaller than a goose, but bigger than a crow? Or is it smaller than a crow, but bigger than a robin kind of thing? What are some of the colors you saw in the bird and what was it doing? And then, of course, being attached to your phone, it knows where you are and what time of year it is, and it gives you a list of possible things. And so it can narrow down your list quite fast for you by just putting in some real basic information. The National Audubon has a similar app that does sort of the same thing. So real simple things can help you narrow down what you're seeing. Bird banding is another way that scientists track birds. And so here you can see some examples of that. So bird bands are aluminum bands provided by the USGS that we put on the legs of birds. And here you can see black-throated blue warbler with a pair of banding pliers around its legs. So you're putting a little tiny bracelet essentially around its leg, and it has a unique ID number. And so if that bird gets captured somewhere else, we get to find out information about where that bird has gone. And we take measurements. So this bird was having its wing measured, and we measure other things. And you can explore bird banding locally. So if you live in central New York, bird banding occurs at the Braddock Bay Bird Observatory up near Rochester. It's not something you can explore this spring, unfortunately, because of the COVID protocols. We are not open to visitors. But hopefully by fall that will change. And certainly before the pandemic, it was a place where we had lots of visitors while we were banding birds during migration. You can watch, I'm not going to play this video because I think it's about 5-10 minutes. You can watch a video where Dave Vonser, a friend of mine, explains bird banding on YouTube. So when you go to YouTube, just look up Braddock Bay Bird Observatory on National Public Radio. So NPR did a story on Braddock Bay several years ago, and there's a good video that shows sort of the banding process just by looking up that title. You'll get it in YouTube. But once we're open, keep track of the website. You can go to our website, which is bbbo.org, and see, and they'll tell you when we're going to be open for visitors, or you can always send me an email and ask me, hey, are you guys open for visitors yet? I'm currently the president, so I will know when we're open for visitors. But it won't be this spring, unfortunately, due to COVID. Another way that scientists track birds are through radar. So here you can see, this is from fall of 2016. This big mass of water is Hurricane Matthew hitting Florida. But all these little masses of water up here are birds around radar towers. So there's a way you can tell this is rain, or bird and not rain, but basically radar, NEXRAD, picks up water in the sky, and birds are mostly water, just like we are mostly water. And so they reflect the radar beam back to the radar site, and they get picked up. Most weather sites filter out biological targets. You can also pick up insects using radar. But you can see here's a live actual radar showing there's some rain out here, right? And this is just loops, but this is right around sunset on the East Coast. You can see all this water, right, pops off the ground. Well, that's birds coming off the ground up into the atmosphere. And those birds are, if they're songbirds, they're migrating anywhere between 200 and 2,000 feet up, okay, or at least on the East Coast. So since most sites filter out birds, you might want to wonder, there are some sites that don't filter out birds, but a better place to go looking for information about when you can expect migration is Birdcast. So not many of you knew about Birdcast. So it's a website, birdcast.info. I'm going to quickly show you that. I can get to it. Too many things up. Here we go. So Birdcast uses information about winds, time of year, previous migrations the nights before to predict if we're going to have a heavy or a light migration. So here's the prediction for tonight. There's not going to be much going on. Why? Well, I already told you, it's spring migration. Birds are moving with warm fronts. We clearly don't have a warm front tonight. We have the opposite of that, right? It's supposed to get down to like 27 in Canandaigua, where I am. So there's not going to be much migration here. There's going to be some migration, though, down in southern Texas and Florida. So you can get a sense. And so for birders, this is great because it can tell you, hey, after a big flight, the next day is a good day to go out because there's going to be some new species around that I haven't seen for 6 months, right? And so you can see they cast, so that's for the 21st. Here's for the 22nd. It's still going to be kind of cold, not much going on, but you can see there's a difference in the middle of the country. They expect more migration in the middle of the country tomorrow night and a bit more on the East Coast the next night. You can also see what happens. So here's a map. I'm going to go to the live map. So these are the maps of what migration did occur. I'm going to go back one night. And it's going to load the data. Hopefully it's going to play. Oh, I got to play it. There we go. So you're going to see a little line. That line is sunset moving across. And you can see there was some pretty big migration last night. Not here where I am in New York, right? But maybe over here in this part of New York, there was much more migration, right? And clearly up the East Coast, there was a lot of migration. And they're using the radar data from last night to show you the movement. They use Doppler radar to know which direction the movement is. And you can tell the density of birds in the air using the radar. So that was last night. If we go the 18th, again, we can see some differences. So a bit more movement here along the East Coast, a bit more movement up the middle of the country, much more movement here in Western New York, right on the 18th, right? So this is not a forecast of what's going to happen. This is actually a record of the amount of migration that happened on those nights. So you can use that to sort of look and see how much happened, or you can use the predictive maps to know how much migration you should expect to see. And for birds, this is again a great resource to know, hey, is tomorrow going to be a good day if I go out birding? Right? Am I going to see, you know, with this cold weather, we clearly know it's not going to be. But sometimes you just don't know how good migration will be, and these maps will help you predict that. All right, just a couple last things. So one way that I'm tracking migration now is through individual remote sensing as part of a project called MODIS. So MODIS uses radio towers, and here's a radio tower with some radio antennas on it. And this radio tower does not transmit music or anything. It's a radio receiving tower. And it picks up these little tags, which are radio tags, which you can convert on birds or bats, or they've been even put on butterflies. And these radio tags emit a signal at a frequency that this tower can pick up. And radio tracking of animals is not new. We've been doing that for quite a long time. But what's new is that we can now have lots of tags operating on the same frequency. And so we can have lots of towers that are operating at the same frequency, listening for these birds and other animals that have these tags on them. So here's a map from the folks who started MODIS up in Bird Studies Canada. So here's a Swainson's thrush that has a tag on it. And here's an idea of if there are towers at these locations, right? You might pick up that bird as it flies by. So you got to capture the bird, put the tag on it, and then let it go about its life, and you can pick up where it goes. So I'm going to go this. They might be like, well, how many of these radio towers are there? Well, there's quite a lot, and more are going up all the time. So here's a world view. There's towers, some over in Western Australia. There's some in Europe. But you can see we got a lot in North America. The folks in Bird Studies Canada started this, and it's spread into our neck of the woods, right? So now I'm getting in closer. All these little yellow dots are where you will find radio towers, and this is the most current data I got today from the MOVIS website to show where those towers are. If I zoom in even further, you can see here Rochester, right? So I'm over in this area, Geneva's over in this area, right? You can see we have some towers around us. We got a wall of towers or a fence of towers across Pennsylvania. We got a gauntlet of towers up here in Ontario, right? So if I put one of these tags on a bird, it can't go anywhere without likely getting picked up by another tower. And these little ellipses are the how far out these towers pick up birds. And here's even closer. So there is no tower in Canandaigua, but there are towers over near Geneva. There's some at Montezuma. There's one over here in Braddock Bay. Braddock Bay operates this tower up at Braddock Bay, as well as a tower that is on top of Seneca Meadows, one of their garbage piles. This has a tower on the top of it. There's one down in Ithaca. So these are some of our local towers. New York certainly has more towers that we could use. I'd love to see some here in the Adirondacks. And there's a project going on between a bunch of partners in the Northeast and New England to basically put towers across New Hampshire and Vermont and the Northern Adirondacks, so we can pick up birds that are moving through there as well. Well, let me just show you, and then we'll go to questions. I know we're running a little bit over, but I got to show you this. This is so cool. All right, not that. We're done with that. Where did it go? There we go. So my data is so new, I don't even have it off the internet yet. So this is through the MOVIS site. So when I put a tag on a bird and it gets registered in the MOVIS site, the data is collected centrally by Bird Studies Canada, and then I get to go in and see, well, where has my bird been detected? So these are all birds that are part of the group that I work with up at Braddock Bay that we've been banding. These birds up top are birds that tags have been put on by the Montezuma folks who we work with too. But I want to show you these, I want to show you at least one blackpoll warbler path. So let's look at this guy. So you can see this is the number of days he was detected and the number of towers he was, or it could be a she, I don't actually know offhand, it was detected at. So let me show you what kind of data we get from this. So I'll show you a table. So you can see we put this tag on a bird at Braddock Bay on September 14th. This is last fall. It stayed at Braddock Bay until September 25th, and then it left. A month later, it was picked up at Patuxent Refuge, which is out on the coast. And then it was picked up at another tower at Patuxent River Park. And where you don't know where Patuxent is, I'll show you. So on the map, you know where Assateague Island is, and you know sort of where Patuxent's down this way. So here's a map version of this bird's movements. And where's the play button? Oh, there it is. So you see it stays here, it says it's moving, and then it took a month. Now this path is not necessarily the path it took, but that's the most direct path if it went gradually. It might have gone somewhere else first. In fact, I have blackpolls that have sort of moved along the shoreline here and then gone down to Pennsylvania and then gone down the Delaware. But the interesting thing about all these blackpolls that we tagged that came through Braddock Bay, that again, we're moving from northern Canada first, right? They all go down here. The ones that I detected other towers all go as far as down here into Delaware and the Maryland coast, and then I don't detect them anymore. Why? Well, I already told you, they went out over the Atlantic and they didn't make landfall to Brazil. And unfortunately, there's no MOVIS towers in Brazil yet. So I don't have ability to detect them down there. Plus these things have a battery, so they don't last forever. Let's show you a Swainson's thrush just for comparison. So which one do I want? I think I want this one. I'll know in a minute. No, I don't want that one. I only went to Georgia. You're like, only Georgia? That's pretty far. But hang on one second. I got to cheat sheet of what I want. Yeah, let's look at that one. All right, this one was picked up 25 days at 4 different towers. So let's look at the table. So stuck around Braddock Bay for quite a while, and then it takes off on the 10th. So we don't detect it there anymore. It gets detected at this tower, SGL 143, and this tower, SGL 154, all on the same night, a day later. And then about a month later, it gets picked up at this tower, which ends in CR, and that stands for Costa Rica. And there are towers in Costa Rica. So we can see this bird's movement. A little broader scale. So it's going to stay here. Those other towers that gets picked up at the next night are there, and then it takes all this time again to get down to Costa Rica. Did it make that direct flight like that? No, but it did go down to Costa Rica. And we have lots of, about half of the swinks and thrushes we picked up, made it at least down to Florida where we detected them, and we picked up about 4 or 5 that go down into Costa Rica or Colombia. So this is an exciting new technology that we're using. The more towers are going up, the more data we get. And more biologists are putting these kinds of tags on the birds so that we know much more about individuals and where they're going and when they get there. So I went over a little bit, so I'm going to stop. Sorry about that. So for those of you who have stuck around, thank you. And I have time to hang out and take a few questions if you have time to ask a few questions.
So there were a few questions in the chat.
Okay.
Some of them, let's go back a little bit, were one of them was they wanted to know if some of these birds were showing up earlier, that they saw a red-winged blackbird, for example, last month.
Yeah, so red wings show up pretty early. So it's not uncommon for red wings to be around even late March. So they are one of the earliest arriving back. They're sort of the sentinels of spring for most birders. They're really obvious because they're really noisy. And you know, they're on wetlands usually, so they're easy to see. But I think maybe what the question is the timing of migration shifting with changing in climate? Quite frankly, yes, it is. So there are climate changes certainly impacting when birds migrate. With warming climate, you can expect that there could be movement up to the spring earlier, which could be beneficial for birds. But it's more complex than that. There's the effect of climate change on birds is shifting some of their schedules somewhat, and it sort of depends on the species. And whether it's a long distance or a short distance migrant, whether it's having a bigger effect or not. So it's having an effect, but the effect it has is sort of complicated. I can't like say for all birds it's, you know, this particular effect.
And then another question in the chat was, do the young stay with the parents on their first migration?
Yes and no, they don't. So these are not geese that migrate in flocks and they can be taught socially where to go. That's a pretty cool thing about songbirds. When the young leave the nest, they won't ever see their parents again, quite likely. And they have to make that first journey all on their own. And they migrate in sort of mixed species flocks. So there may be other species of their kind up in the air with them, but they're not migrating in sort of those form flocks. They're sort of very loose flocks of, you know, clouds of birds migrating together. And so what we know about this is that those young birds, because they're not going to be taught where to go, it's genetic. So they have wired in them, both neurally and genetically, they know sort of what direction to go and how far to go to get to their wintering site. And likewise, they must have some genetic information to help them return in the spring. And some birds, you know, I've caught birds, the colleges have a field site, Hanley, some of you may be familiar with that if you're from the colleges. I've caught birds out there multiple summers where, you know, a yellow warbler returns to the same darn bush and breeds there after going to Central and South America. So these birds can get very specific. They can find the same basically place they nested the year before. But the young have to do that all based on basically genetic information. And that means they're more susceptible to, you know, if they get blown off course by bad winds or something, they're more susceptible to not being able to get back on course. So often when you find a rare bird in the area, right now, I think I saw this earlier, there's a black-throated gray warbler, which is a Western species, and I think it's in Amherst outside of Buffalo. I would almost guarantee that species is a younger bird and not an older bird, and because they're more likely to get blown off or lose their way. What was the next question?
I think the next question you kind of answered as well. They wanted to know if songbirds migrate in groups like geese.
Yeah, so not flocks like geese, not V formations,
right,
but sort of mixed species flocks. And that this one picture of artwork, I'm gonna go back to my PowerPoint, sort of shows what it might look like. This is, I didn't mention, this is Charlie Harper. He's an artist who does these very schematic pictures of birds. Am I still sharing? I'm not sharing, am I?
Not at the moment, no.
Thank you. Hang on, back to Zoom. Forgot I turned share off.
There you go.
All right, so this is a Charlie Harper. This called, what's this called? I can't even see it. Bad eyes. Mystery of Missing Migrants. But this is sort of how they're flying. Not necessarily this close, but these are all different species migrating around the same time, right? And they're all up there sort of in the air column moving. And one way we track them too is you can design these little microphones to listen, and they make these little night calls while they're migrating. And if you know a little bit about who's making what call, it's not like identifying song if you're good at that. There's very short calls. You can tell, oh, that's a thrush or that's a sparrow. And you can hear them moving over in these sort of mixed species flocks if you listen for them while you're sleeping. You gotta be up, obviously.
And then the next person, they had a question in the chat, but they also had their hand raised. So I have them with the ability to speak now, and they are off mute. So if you wanted to ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Okay. Altitude, oxygen, and airwaves. You said 200 to 2,000 feet. As you go up higher, there's less resistance, and wouldn't they be more efficient, or does it have to do with oxygen requirements for long distance migration?
Yeah, well, their oxygen demands are much higher than ours per gram of body. They have a much higher metabolic rate. So
That tells it right there.
yeah, so but they also have much better hemoglobin for sequestering that oxygen. So they're better at getting it than we are. You know, and the songbirds are one thing, but you know, you have like these bar-headed geese that fly over the Himalayas. Right? I mean,
Oh my God.
I mean, they're flying at altitudes where we would pass out. And I know I saw a talk at an ornithological conference a couple of years back by an astronaut who was actually studying Himalayan geese. They were sort of interested in their physiology from an oxygen standpoint.
For the lower 48, what's the maximum altitude you know of for migration? Did they go to 10,000 feet?
Well, they're going over the Rockies, the western.
So that's 14,000. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, some of them
Thank
are,
you.
and there are songbirds that would cross that.
Jeez. Spectacular. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
And then I have someone that wanted to know if they should keep their feeders up all year.
Good question. Yeah, and well, if you have them up in the winter, keep them up in the winter. Birds sort of get dependent on them as a food source. And so it is a good idea to keep them up. In the summer, there's lots of food around. So if you didn't want to maintain your feeder, you could take them down in the summer. But then you're not going to see all those awesome species that are around. So, but the important thing is if you're keeping them up is to clean them. Make sure you clean them well. There's online you can find information about cleaning them because they can be a source of disease spread for the birds that are using them. And bird feeding has there's some studies, particularly in Europe, that have shown that bird feeding habits of Europeans has sort of altered the migratory paths of some species. It is about food. And that's happened here in the United States. There are species in the fact that we have Canada geese year round here in New York, for example, that was not always the case. Why is that happening now? Why you see them in the winter? That's because there's food around, and that food they're going out to farm fields, and the collection of whatever the crop it happens mechanically now instead of being hand-picked, and there's a lot of waste that gets left on fields, and that waste becomes food for those birds. So there's a phenomenon called short stopping, where birds aren't migrating as far as they used to, at least for some species and some groups, because they have feeders available.
And then a question to kind of go along with the question about bird feeders were, what's the best feeders to attract songbirds?
Different feeders. So if you go to the Cornell website and look at Project Feeder Watch, they have some information about feeder types that you could look at there. Different feeders attract different kinds of birds. So certain birds only feed on the ground or on platforms. The kind of food that you put in the feeder will affect what you get, whether you're putting sort of a bird seed mix or all of a particular kind of seed, whether you put suet feeders up, and certainly whether you put nectar feeders up is going to determine whether you get things like hummingbirds, or sometimes nectar feeders will attract orioles. So if you want a variety of birds, the best thing to do is put up a variety of feeder types, a variety of food types.
And then we have when the warblers spend 72 hours over the ocean, do they sleep?
No, they're flapping their wings. So songbirds can't soar like hawks or a lot of the seabirds that you see. So in order to stay aloft, they need to basically keep flapping their wings the whole time they're up there. So they don't sleep that we know of. Birds are capable of this sort of what's called unihemispheric sleep, where they can sleep one side of their brain at a time and they can keep one eye open. They do this in sort of flocks for looking out for predators. I don't think there's any evidence that they use unihemispheric sleep while they're migrating, but who knows? Maybe they sleep half a brain at a time. That would be very convenient if we could do that.
There was a few comments that they said that this is also cool, and thank you, and that this was a wonderful talk, and that they enjoyed this very much. And they also enjoyed your talk in May.
Oh, thanks.
And then there was a question about have increased wind power towers affected bird numbers or migration patterns?
Yeah, wind towers certainly can affect birds. They can kill birds in some instances. There's some very horrific horror stories from raptors being influenced by some of the early wind turbine towers out in California. But wind towers are definitely better for birds than coal-fired plants. They're producing pollution that affects birds. And with proper sighting, and when taking into a sort of proper knowledge about birds moving through areas, they can be put up in a way that sort of minimizes the effects they can have on birds. But without that proper knowledge and that proper sighting, they can also be put in areas where they cause problems for birds. They're also causing lots of problems. Some of them are causing problems for bats as well. So it is a green energy, but it does have sort of a cost. But again, wind turbines are probably less. I mean, some birds will collide into them, but there's probably less collisions into wind towers than there are to high rises in the urban centers of our country.
And it looks like there are 3 more questions in the chat, and I think we'll end with those. One is, can you speak to the eruption of redpolls, grosbeaks, and crossbills?
Yeah, so those are one of those eruptive migrants. So they will stay up north when basically they're all seed eaters. So when they erupt, they come down, and if you have feeders, they come to your feeders. And so lots of people have been taking pictures of these birds and putting them online this winter. And I've seen pictures from as far south as Texas for some of these northern birds. But they're basically moving because the crops of seeds that they depend on have crashed, and the seeds that they depend on from the trees that they depend on, they go through these cycles of boom and bust. And so eruptions happen sort of in a cyclical fashion, because we know these seed crops are going to increase, and then all of a sudden they're going to drop off, and they're not going to be enough seeds to support all of those seed-eating finches up in their winter habitats, and that's when they will spread. And so those birds they're not anticipating migration by keeping track of day length or anything like that. They're keeping track of food, and something about the relative abundance of food is causing a physiological change in them to say, hey, go south, find some more food.
And then how could competitive interaction shape refueling during stopover?
Competitive interactions reshape. Well, so there are examples, and I think that was from Maddie Sutton, my former student. Thanks, Maddie. There are competitive interactions. So, you get there. One term that we use is when migrants come down, they're migrating at night and they land during the day. And if there lots of migrants are moving through, you have what's called a fallout, where you just get birds everywhere, warblers, orioles, depending on what's moving, there's tons of birds everywhere, and birders love fallout because they can see lots of species. But in those cases, there's probably too many birds in that habitat at that time to be supported by all the food, or by the food that's there. And there are certainly examples published in the scientific literature of, density dependent effects. The more birds that are in a stopover habitat, the lower the benefit that is for any given individual, right? It's like if we all stop at the same McDonald's on the highway, it takes forever to get your food, right? Well, it's sort of a similar thing going on. And Maddie, thank you for this slide about stopover quality. That was yours, so as you know.
This last one is also from Maddie.
Okay.
Do you think that migration as a life history strategy will become less prevalent as climate variability increases?
I haven't thought about that. I don't think so. I mean, migration's been happening for a very, very long time, and migration routes have evolved and changed. I don't think that climate is going to become so homogeneous that migration would cease. So I don't think it's going to become less prevalent. I just think the nature of individual population or species migrations are going to shift to some extent. Mm-hmm. But you and I can talk about that more later, Maddie.
And then we have a lot of thanks and thank yous from people within attendance. And one that says, please come back, and they want to know if they can email you with questions if they have any.
Yes, you can email me. So my email is my last name without the R. I can put it in the chat right now. Deutschlander, because it's too long. It's always been too long to fit on any standardized forms, at hws.edu. Did I spell that right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So go ahead and email me. I get a lot of emails, but I'll get to you at some point. Don't worry about that. I'm on sabbatic right now, so I do have a little time for those kinds of things. Yes, my beard got whiter, Chevy. I see that. It's my professorial look. It's my pandemic beard.
So I just want to thank everyone in attendance tonight, and thank you, Mark, for all of your hard work with the Hobart Williams Smith Speaker Series and for your presentation tonight. It was fantastic.
Thanks. And I just wanted to mention, since I saw Chevy's name on there, who coordinates with alums, I know sometimes alums during reunion come out to Hanley. This summer, I'll be putting up a Motus Tower at Hanley. So if you come back, for any of the future alum interactions. And there's a Hanley trip. Come on out, and you'll be able to see an example of one of these Mose towers attached to our lab out at the Hanley site. And I'll be doing some projects starting probably next summer, tagging gray catbirds, which are very prevalent out of Hanley. But thank you. I want to just thank the Wood Library and thank all of you who showed up tonight. It was great to see some familiar names and also great to see some names I didn't recognize. So I know I'm reaching out to others, and I appreciate you spending the hour and a half learning more about birds.
All right.